Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give a minute or so to let people join and get set up, and then we'll get going. Nice to see some familiar names and a lot of new ones. All right, we're just at the top of the hour, so I'm going to get going. We're going to start with a little bit of housekeeping, but first I'd like to just thank everybody for joining us for today's webinar, Community Composting Success, Best Management Practices for Community Composting Team Building. In terms of housekeeping, I just want to remind folks that this webinar is being recorded and that the recording will be posted on the Northeast Recycling Council website. You'll receive an email letting you know when it's available. Also, you guys are all on mute in order to keep background noise at a minimum so we get a good recording on that. We're going to ask that you hold questions until the presentation is complete, but at any time you can be typing your questions in as we go along through the webinar using the question feature in the webinar dashboard. So for those of you who aren't familiar with GoToWebinar, on the top right of your screen, you should see a small little orange rectangular box with an arrow pointing to the right. When you click on that arrow, it'll open your GoToWebinar control panel. And I don't know, a little ways down, maybe a third of the way down, you'll see the question box, or it might be towards the bottom of this panel, which is where you can type the question and then just hit send, and the questions will all be correlating. They'll all be gathering there as we go through, so we'll be able to scroll back through them. Just note that the control panel does have a habit of closing itself, so you can keep it open if you want to by clicking on View at the top of the control panel and then deselecting the Auto Hide Control Panel function. So that's just a little click. And that way it'll just keep it there so you don't have to keep finding it. Otherwise, just look for that little orange arrow. This webinar is being offered as part of a larger project of the Northeast Recycling Council called Implementing Rural Community Composting in Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, and Vermont, which is being funded by the USDA Rural Utilities Services Solid Waste Management Grant Program. So big thanks to them. As advertised, this is a two-part webinar, and so I just want to be clear about the goals of this first webinar, which is really to provide an overview of the people side of community composting. So visions, goals, roles, tasks, partnership building, all of that stuff. We're going to be sharing a lot of photos of different sites as well as lessons learned from some of the sites we've been working in. And I do want to note that while we're focusing a bit on how to get a community compost site started, a lot of what we're talking about is just as applicable to existing sites, especially ones that may be feeling a little stuck or going through some either growing or shrinking pains. So we hope you'll leave this webinar with lots of ideas for next steps and some guidelines for facilitating productive conversations within your own communities. Just as a little plug, part 2 will focus on how to compost, so the science, systems, management, all of that. And that is scheduled for Tuesday, March 31st, and we'll be circulating more details about that in the coming weeks. Today's presenters, I'm Natasha Duarte, the Director of the Composting Association of Vermont. I'm joined by Libby Weiland, who's the statewide network coordinator for Vermont Community Gardens Network, and Cassandra Hemingway, who's the outreach manager for Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District. All right, so how do you get started? I want to start by just defining what it is we're talking about when we talk about community composting. So community composting sites vary widely in mission, size, affiliations, and participants, and they're located all over the place. So community gardens, schools, public parks, co-housing developments, neighborhoods, food shelves, libraries. And from our experience, they seem to really be, as more organic diversion conversation is happening around our states and around the country, they're popping up in all kinds of places. The size of community composting sites can range anywhere from as small as 10 square feet to upwards of 20,000 square feet. In some places, regulations may also play a role in determining the scale. For example, in Vermont, we often talk about community composting as staying below the solid waste facility permitting thresholds, which is 100 cubic yards of total material per year, or about 40 cubic yards of food scraps plus carbon materials. For some other states, this scale might be seen more as micro composting, even just smaller than what other folks think of as community composting, but it really runs the gamut. We also often talk about it as larger than backyard, but smaller than commercial composting. But I do want to just share briefly that in Vermont, we're starting to broaden that and really think about our backyard composters as part of the community, of the composting infrastructure within a community. As many backyard folks are acting as compost champions, they're playing important roles as partners for community sites. And in many cases, they're actually directly engaging in both backyard and community composting activities. So we're really welcoming backyard composters in as well, and valuing the role that they can play in championing composting through their communities. Scale aside, there are other characteristics of community composting. So they're often volunteer run. Some are run by nonprofit organizations or on farms. There's often a strong emphasis on promoting community partnerships and connections. And the focus is typically on managing organics locally and producing compost for local use. And that's in both urban and rural settings. So now that we have an idea of the kind of sites that we're talking about, how do you get started when you think maybe you're a champion or maybe you're an organization that's trying to support and promote community composting in your area? Just like this two-part webinar, we recommend really starting with the people. You'll be hearing a lot about communication today because, as with any community activity, whether it's focused on compost or another topic, effective communication is often what makes or breaks the system. Clarifying and being able to clearly articulate your mission, your vision, your goals and priorities for your group also directly informs decision-making on the compost system and management side. And it enables you to better explain the project to potential volunteers and partners and curious neighbors. So really being clear about this up front is a stakeholder engagement tool, and it also directly impacts how you might choose to set up your system, or if you have an existing system, how it might need to be tweaked a little bit as you get clearer on your goals. Examples of different goals that often inform broader decision-making include making as much local compost as possible, maybe for a garden, and they just want to crank as much material through their system as they can. Or it could really be focused on educating and inspiring community members and setting up a variety of different systems so people who come and visit and do trainings at your site see that it's not one size fits all, and that there's a system or an option for for all different needs. The impacts that these decisions have on the system and site management are going to be reflected as we go through the different components of the webinar. Next slide. So I just want to mention that we're not going to do a deep dive into how to have these conversations around identifying opportunities and issues. There are a lot of different tools out there that you can consider using. We've shared a number of resources, these 5 resources, and they're available in the GoToWebinar control panel under handouts. You'll see 5 of 5 there. Links to them will also be included when you get the recording from this webinar. So these are some tools that we're using as part of this larger project with the sites that we're setting up in these different states. But there are a lot of different tools that are out there, and what's most important is that groups find a tool that really fits the style and the needs of your group. So there's not one right way to do it. It's just a matter about figuring out how to have that effective communication at the start. So inputs and outputs. What a successful community composting site really boils down to is lining up inputs. So people's time, those partnerships, materials, the tumblers, the bins, tools, whatever it might be that you need for your site, whatever system you're choosing. And then the feedstocks, of course, are the ingredients that go into making compost. And when you get all of those lined up, you end up with a variety of outputs. So the finished compost, increased awareness and engagement by both the people participating and neighbors and hopefully the wider communities. So some engagement around environmental stewardship, as well as this larger community engagement and volunteerism. And so we've really found is that as communities come together to support community composting, it actually increases the overall connectedness and sense of belonging and resiliency of the community in a much larger way. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Libby. And we're going to learn as we go through this that often, especially at the beginning, the limiting factor may well be the human capacity and not so much the system capacity. So it's really important to fine-tune your system to what it is that the folks engaged can manage.
Great, thanks, Natasha. What better question to ask next than who do you need on your team? Who's going to help you get this done? And actually, I'm going to pause for just a second just to say there, for whomever's mic is still on, there's a little bit of a background noise. So just to note that.
Yeah, I think I just took care of that. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So who do you need on your team? We threw up a few different kind of classic roles that we have seen work really well, some combinations we've seen work really well in compost management, community compost management. So having a site manager, someone who's overseeing the site, having a team of helpers that can help just get the work done. And then of course you need people who are contributing food scraps and other materials to the site and potentially using the compost as well. And so we're going to go into detail into kind of each of these roles in just a moment. But what we really want to encourage here is for you and your team, kind of as you're getting set up, to really discuss as a group, who do you need on your team and how are you going to fill some of those roles? So it might be that your unique community has a very different configuration of kind of roles. There might be some overlap in some of these roles in terms of getting some of that work done. You might get creative with titles, which we'll have a few examples a little bit later on that. Just to kind of keep things fun and kind of connect with the community that you're trying to reach. You may already have an organizational structure that you're working with. So if you're at a nonprofit or a school or in a community garden that has staff or volunteers that will fit into these roles really well. Or you may need to do some recruiting from the broader community. So whatever the case is, the point is to start thinking and recruiting early in your project's development. And so what we're going to get into in here in just a second is just a snapshot of what these roles look like and then qualifications for filling them. So starting with those compost site managers. So again, overall management, training and scheduling of volunteers. They're really at the helm of the project, making sure that everything gets done. So qualifications, they should know how to compost, or at least be interested in getting some deeper level training. Good at organizing a group of people, so scheduling, communicating, delegating. And then really have time available to commit to the project. So these are the people who are going to be putting in the most time to make sure it can be pulled off and just being realistic about that commitment. You may be noting as you're hearing all of these qualifications that there are a lot of different skills mentioned here, and you may not know one person that has all of those. Well, I put an S on the end of managers for a reason. That it's best if it's more than one person, really, that you're working with a team, 2 or more people that can provide different skills sort of to the management and kind of hone in on those different things. Also, that concept of redundancy, we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but how important that is to not just have one person at the helm who's keeping everything in their heads, that something happens or one person needs to leave, that there's always someone that's kind of in that role that can support the management and keep it going. And we'll also talk about this more later, but the concept of partnerships and how partnerships are not just having yet another person from your community and recruiting another person from your community, but thinking about their organizations or groups like master composters or master gardeners that can help support that role at a deeper level. And then just one other thing I wanted to note about site managers is that in many situations, these are also the idea people. So they're going to be the cheerleaders who get the project off the ground and get it integrated into their community. That's often the case. However, not always. And so I know that Cassandra had a question about that. I'm going to give her a second to ask.
Yeah, thank you, Libby. I was wondering if you could speak to the concept of having your compost managers coming from the site, approaching, say, VCGN or another organization, versus an organizing body such as a solid waste management district or the community garden network, finding a champion. So in other words, what's the difference between somebody coming from the site and wanting to make it happen versus recruiting somebody who may not have thought of this in the beginning?
Yeah, I'll let Natasha take that, the answer there, if that's okay.
Sure. So this gets a little bit at the sustainability of a site question, and we're going to be talking about that pretty in depth a little bit later in the webinar. But it's really important to have, for people engaged in a site and participating in the site, to feel some sense of ownership over it. And I know on the call or on the webinar, there are a number of people who may be these site managers or compost stewards or part of a compost team. And they're also folks from organizations like Composting Association of Vermont or solid waste districts or garden networks like Libby, who work with sites to try to get that. And for organizations who are thinking like, oh, one of our missions is to help promote organics diversion, it can be tempting, and in some cases it can be a great idea to identify effective sites that could be effective community composting sites. And I think this comes back directly to the goal of the site. So if you have a site that you think would be really great and there's some interest, just to be clear up front about what the goals of the site are. If it's not to be a really strong, consistent diversion mechanism or diversion system, but more for a place where you can set up trainings and bring people to and maybe have different systems, that's very different than some of the other goals that other sites might have. And so I think there could be a place for both, but I guess I would just caution folks who are thinking like, oh, let's get this off the ground. And if the real champion and the real idea person who is really pushing for it is not intending to stay on and be an integral part of that system, if it's not in your own community or a group that you're already personally and now potentially considering professionally being involved with, that's kind of a red flag for what's going to happen once the site is set up. So I guess I would just, I wouldn't discourage it outright, but I would add some caution and just urge up front to get really clear about the trajectory of that site and some of the human resource challenges that you might be encountering. Does that help, Cassandra?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Great. All right. So in keeping with that, we just wanted to kind of think a little bit about what some of those people might look like and where they're kind of coming from. Your site managers might be someone with a lot of expertise and enthusiasm related to compost, or they might just be a concerned resident who wants to make a difference in their community. So kind of to what Natasha was talking about, paying attention to kind of who's getting drawn in and utilizing them to the best of their abilities. And I know, Cassandra, you had an example you wanted to share kind of related to that.
Yeah, thank you. Calling your attention to the lower left photo. the gentleman next to the Jora composter and the can there, which is set aside for browns. That's Ronald Bergeron, and he's our compost manager at Corey Hill Apartments in Barrie Town. And he's a great example of somebody who really initiated the whole community composting site. And it's hard to tell from this photo because you can't see the other half of the yard, but he's actually training about 10 fellow residents on how to use the Jora in this photo. So I just wanted to show an example of, he got some training from us, he got some training from Libby and Natasha, and then he went on to train his neighbors in how to use the system.
And I'll just chime in that that's a great effective strategy if there's someone in your group who has that level of interest to promote a sense of ownership as well as really empowering that compost champion or site manager in terms of not just being a recipient of the training, but then being, it's you learn the best by teaching, right? So by actually then extending out what he had learned to his fellow neighbors to get them engaged and involved.
Oh, great. So, so also kind of related to that idea of extending that the work that needs to be done and recruiting more people. So then there's your sort of your compost team, and those are the folks who are going to do some of the same tasks as your managers, but more in a support role. And some might be there for a one time, and some might be there on a regular basis. And so we'll talk a little bit as to what Cassandra and Natasha were talking about around those trainings in just a minute. But just to think about that team and qualifications you need to be thinking about. So definitely either know how to compost or can be trained. I think depending on, I guess, the level of involvement of your compost team or volunteers, that they need to have some level of kind of understanding how the system works and how compost works in general. Being task oriented, so good at following instructions and getting work done. And then really taking note of a variety of skills that compost volunteers can contribute that aren't necessarily the usual suspects, like, they know a lot about composting or can do a really great job of layering and turning compost piles. But things like education, outreach, partnership building, and even just really great delegation are really are equally valuable on a community compost project, because that communication aspect and kind of education aspect is a big part of what you're trying to pull off. One example of a great way of utilizing more involved compost volunteers is this idea Natasha had mentioned to me about the rodent patrol, and this concept that, taking that job off of the site manager's list of things to pay attention to rodents and vermin on the compost site, and having a team that can kind of be dedicated to really paying attention to that, knowing what to look for, knowing how to deal with it, so being educated in that area and really dedicating their time to that. So there's a lot of delegating of larger responsibilities to team members that can make a real difference in getting the work done. And then in terms of recruiting people for your team and for your volunteering in general, in the upper right-hand corner, the example I want to point out is Charlotte Central School, which is here in Vermont. And I believe, I hope I'm not wrong about this, but it's the fourth graders, I believe, that are a dedicated classroom that supports the volunteer site manager every year. So every year it's the fourth grade class that helps to do the turning and learns about how the system works and educates their fellow students. So it's a great way for students to learn skills, become advocates, become educators themselves, and also for the work to happen. You have a dedicated group right there. So thinking about groups that can benefit as well from that. Also thinking about groups of people, particularly for larger, more kind of one-time one-time situations that need to do service or fulfill volunteer hours. So like high schoolers, community service hours, or community gardeners that have volunteer hours that they have to put in. Thinking about how you can kind of utilize those again for mutual benefit. And then the last example I want to point out here around this is from in the lower right-hand corner is Red Hook Community Farm in New York City. And getting to what Natasha was talking earlier around goals. Someone who was working with the project was telling me about a big one of their big goals was really to be a community-powered project. And so they designed a system that uses team and work party labor and really gets at that initial goal of it's community powered and brings people together. And so in terms of their design of turning these windrows, they also that affects kind of who they recruit and how they recruit as well, and how the work gets done by that team. And then I wanted just to kind of a few other examples. So there are lots of diverse ways of engaging people and different ways that people might want to get involved. I know that Natasha, you wanted to talk a little bit about one example.
Yeah, so in general, and as well, just really tying back thinking, like when you're sitting with your group, thinking about all the different roles, and I recommend doing this on, a flip chart or, a big piece of paper or stickies or some way of really getting input from your group. But the decision or the different kinds of tasks are going to also be dedicated by choices around systems. So it goes both ways. So for example, in the lower left corner, you'll see this is at Ludlow Area Community Garden, and Rosa, one of the compost team members, is showing someone how to add stuff to their system. And so I've worked with groups who just around food scrap or feedstock collection. So when people are coming and bringing their food scrap pails from their kitchens or from other places to your site, some sites really emphasize training and have a lot of signage, and everyone who is contributing some materials are actually directly putting it into the system themselves and then adding the appropriate amount of carbon depending on the kind of system that they're running. In other sites, like the Ludlow Garden site, they have their compost stewards much more actively involved. They have a bin that people can bring their bags or their food scraps, kitchen caddies, and empty it into a larger container that serves the purpose of also measuring, because they know the volume of the container. And then it's the compost stewards who are more actively engaged in then actually adding that material into the system. There's another, I believe it's Elm Street in Garden in Montpelier, who has sort of a hybrid where they have a closed bin set up with smaller bins inside and some wood shavings set out. And so people come and contribute they put their food scraps in and add a little bit of the food shavings, so they don't have to follow a certain day or time schedule for coming and doing drop off. They can go anytime and add it, and then a couple times a week, it's the compost team who then adds it actually into their full system. So there's a bunch of different examples of how food scrap collection is managed, and you can imagine how that impacts the roles and training that either just a smaller group, your team needs, or the larger community who is contributing to the system might need. I will note that especially early on for sites that we do recommend that there is some oversight for food scrap drop-off, just until people get the hang of what is being accepted and what is not being accepted, and potential issues for contamination or chopping up in different sizes. And so that's also where your logbooks come in really handy, because then if someone is consistently dropping off and that coincides with when you're having issues with maybe the produce stickers getting involved, that's a cue to your compost management folks that a little bit more training might be needed. So again, it's just depending on what systems and how thinking about the systems you choose and how that impacts the roles that your team and your managers need to play. And then also how many managers or team members do you have? And that might need to influence the systems that you set up. So it sort of goes back and forth.
Great, thanks, Natasha. And I think your point and your example are a great transition to this next slide, because I think it's a great example that there's a lot of overlap in these different sort of categories we've set aside. Some people are just dropping off waste and food scraps, I should say, and other materials, and others are involved in a higher level, kind of really kind of a part of that team of volunteers making things happen. And so recognizing what role people can play and what's realistic for the community that you're working with, and where you're located and all of that. One other example I wanted to throw out there is at La Plaza Cultural Community Garden in New York City. They have some really nice signage at their location. So it's a kind of drop off when you like, but they have, so it's the left hand picture on the screen. And it has a nice, you can see the kind of the yes, no list of what can go in. There's another sign, which I'll show you in just a moment, which does a lot around, so here are the steps when you arrive at the site. These are the things that you need to do. Chop up your waste and you know, add browns from this other container. And then this woman right here in the picture is actually using an auger that they have on site to do a little bit of hand mixing, kind of some pre-processing prior to the kind of the deeper processing that happens on the other side of the fence by sort of a team of volunteers and the site managers. So again, just like Natasha said, there are lots of levels at which people can get involved and kind of help the process work and just be a little bit more engaged rather than just dropping things off. They're gonna, if they're actually having to smell and open up the bins and things like that, they might have a little bit of a sense of, okay, I want to make sure I manage this a little bit better, sort my my scraps a little bit better. And then one other thing I want to mention around that is that, you know, some sites will, you know, people who they just have a regular drop off will occasionally have a work party, like something like a sifting party, you know, a job that takes a bunch of hands. It goes better if you have a bunch of people working with it. But again, it gets back to that. You know, it helps get the work done, but it also helps engage people, connect them to a larger community, so that they're a little bit more invested in what happens at the site. So, and then continuing on with what Natasha was saying about kind of the training and keeping people involved in these systems and involved. So sort of once you've found the people that you need, you're ready to determine your site management plan, or ready to schedule volunteers, set up trainings, some things to keep in mind regarding your compost volunteers. So level of interest and commitment from your community. I would say a few things about this. It may be that you have a whole lot of interest and people are saying, oh yeah, I love the idea, but do you have the commitment? I think that those can be two very different things. And so I would say almost in every situation, start small. So dream big, start small. For most projects, most project coordinators would probably say the same. Again, even if it seems like you have a lot of interest, kind of maybe start out with a smaller group of folks to kind of get things up and going. And then you can kind of, once you have a sense of how things are going, you can kind of expand to your capacity. Another thing to pay attention to is every site will have its own unique character, and that's somewhat based upon sort of the interest and passion of the people who are involved. Or, you know, if it's in my case, I'm usually working with community gardens, and so every community garden has its own unique character, just whether it's laid back or super organized, all of those different things. And so again, thinking about how you design your system based on those things, I was talking earlier about coming up with creative names for your different roles and tasks in the garden, or in the compost system. So just paying attention to that sort of stuff, and that will help kind of keep people involved. If it's, you know, things are more fun or things are kind of fit with the way that they're used to things working, that will work a lot better for people. Then thinking, of course, about the time people have available. So starting with the amount of time people have available, having a variety of tasks for people who have different amounts of time. So small tasks, big tasks, one-time tasks, and regular sort of responsibilities. And then when people are available. So the classic example being what happens in the summer for school compost systems? What happens in the winter for community garden compost systems? And it may be that your answer for figuring that out is how you design the system. So you design a system that is kind of according to the seasons that people are available. It may be that you seek partnerships that help to there's another group that would really be interested in taking on the compost system at another time of year or work with you to make that happen. So again, that's all part of thinking about who you're recruiting, who you're training, and how you're going to keep the project up and going. And then last but not least, the sort of the knowledge, skills, and comfort level of the people who are involved. So are your site managers, are they master composters or been doing this their entire lives, or do they need some training? Do you want to set aside some funds to actually send somebody to a master composter training? What level of reliance is your group going to have on other experts to kind of, when you have trouble shooting kind of questions and things like that? What training do your compost volunteers need, just kind of on a regular basis, or orientation, that sort of thing? And then for users at any level, are they comfortable with compost in general? Are they comfortable with sorting things? What kind of orientation do they need? Maybe they even need a compost workshop just to get them comfortable with the concept of compost and just how cool it is and get them excited about it. And then I'm going to emphasize, in fact, I set aside a whole slide for signage because I think signage goes a really long way to help people, to help communicate and help people at different knowledge and skills levels kind of get what they need from the site. So based on what you know about your compost volunteers and users, determining your training, education, signage, what will be most effective. So thinking about, like, if people are just kind of stopping through, they're going to drop off their stuff and there's some very specific things you need for them to do, having really exact instructions and visuals that will help them pull that off. Instructions that I mentioned from La Plaza Cultural from New York City is in the lower right-hand corner. Just a really nice, has a visual, it even has the size of how small to chop things. It has most of the tools are right there on site for them to do that. At another site, I think this was Garden at 45 Elm in Montpelier, they handed out food scrap sorting tips so that people were comfortable and had an understanding of what goes in and what does not. And so that's kind of, they have those tips kind of ahead of time that they can refer to. Always paying attention to, and I would highly encourage in any situation, having everyone who's going to be involved in person at some point for an orientation or training, and potentially with the potential to have to retrain at some point. People learn things at different paces and might need to kind of relearn things as the seasons shift and that sort of thing. And then having a system for ongoing communications so that if there are problems arise and the users sort of notice those, that they have a way to communicate with you, and vice versa, that you have ways to communicate what needs to happen on the site, and using communication systems that work for the people involved, being smart about that. And the last thing I want to say about this is that there are lots more signage examples on CAV's website, which will be referenced in our resource slide a little later on. And I know, Natasha, you wanted to say something else about this concept of communication and signage.
Yeah, I would. This is another great area or topic that you can really engage your group in. So, it could be that someone is like a super sign maker and they're very organized and maybe really linear and have it all planned out. And then they might get frustrated because people are somehow effectively not seeing the signs even though they're there, or, like this one says don't add, why are people adding to it? And people get confused, and not everyone pays the same level of attention as others. And so I think what has been really effective is to make it a fun thing and engage your community and understand, do you need a combination, if it's like a mixed language community, really clear pictures as well as words, or multilingual signage, or is it, is it also just something that people in your community can relate to? And the example I'll give is I was working with this one site, and they all, and maybe this is what brought them together in the beginning, I'm not sure, but they were all like hardcore Harry Potter fans. And so all of their signage and their bins, instead of 1, 2, 3, it was Hufflepuff and Slytherin and all of these different Harry Potter references that had meaning to the group, made it really fun for them. And it was sort of this like double layering of like, they got that, this particular thing was, like they got the meaning in a deeper level than just yes, no, just straight up sort of linear instructions. It was a little more creative and engaging. And it was something that caught their eye that they would pay attention to. And so that's just sort of one of the sort of more different examples that I've encountered personally, but I'm guessing there's a whole lot of different examples out there. And just, have fun with it and make sure that it's meaningful for your whole team and everyone who's participating is what I'd recommend. All right, and so I'm just going to talk a little bit about training and all the different kinds of training that we recommend in getting sites started. So first, just keep in mind, sort of along the lines of what I was just saying, is that people have very different learning styles, and Libby was also talking about this as well. So depending on the role that people are going to play in the system, there may be a need for more of a classroom style setting, but we also really encourage getting people to the site, walking through the site, and not just from an observation sort of like, oh, this is where this is and this is where that is point of view, but really like put the thermometer in someone's hand, let them take the thermometer or the compost tumbler or bin or windrow temperature and record it in the logbook. Have them move materials, practice moving materials in a training through a system. Or if it's a brand new system, adding it. And then once there's material, a lot of the systems are integrated using like a combination of tumbler and bin or bin and windrow. Like then schedule another training when you have enough material accumulated to actually have them see and feel and participate in what that pace and what that rhythm is like. Turn the tumbler, use an auger. These are all, chop things up these are all things that really the more touches people have on it, both literally and figuratively, the better they'll engage with your system. And then the photo in the top left, I just want to do a call out to one of the sites at a co-housing site in Charlotte that I'm working with, because they put on this great compost party where the compost champions actually worked with the kids it's a co-housing setting. So they worked with the kids there to create a presentation about their system. It's a new system, introduced it. They have chickens, they have worms, they have a tumbler. So the kids actually talked through for the adults all the different training, and then they had a big bowl of different kinds of food scraps that the adults chose from and went up to the table, and the kids would look at it and be like, oh, you forgot to remove this PLU sticker. That's too big. Here's a knife, chop it up. This doesn't go to chickens. So it was just, I thought, a really great way of engaging. It was a fun community event, and it engaged everybody, including these little kids, right? So what a better way to really get those systems and empower those kids to be the compost champions in their households, and as well just sort of normalize this idea that, apple peels aren't yucky, the chickens love that or whatever. And so I just wanted to highlight that, and they, just as a little plug, because I had never heard of it, they ended the party with compost cookies. There was an actual recipe for that, which just made it fun, and of course the kids thought that was a great treat. And they're perfectly edible, no gross, no old food scraps involved. So I just wanted to share the different ways of of engaging and training so everybody who's part of your system can be involved. All right, Cassandra, I think you're going to tell us a little bit some of the experiences. We're getting into some lessons learned from different sites that we've all been working at.
Yes. Okay. So I am going to talk about two of the sites that the Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District set up, and some situations we encountered that might be helpful for the conversation. First, I'm going to talk about Ron, who I talked about earlier. He's on the photo on the right. He's got the thermometer and the Jora. So for a little bit more background about the site where Ron is managing, that is a housing authority apartment situation. It's a 30-unit low-income senior housing. And Ron and two other folks from that community came to us for a backyard composting workshop, really, really wanted composting in their backyard. But because there's 30 units there, we felt like it made more sense to make it a community composting site than just straightforward backyard composting. So the three of them got educated. They went to a community composting day-long seminar, and we had some grant funding to get them set up and do some more training. And it went really well, actually. One of the things that Ron and his team told me that was unique about them is all three of them were 80 years old when we started, and that was a couple of years ago. And they brought along a lot of seniors in their community who were very dubious about the whole project. When we first got started, we pretty much had the three of them and a couple other people on site, and we were going with the concept of starting small. But as soon as we got out there, started putting the Jora together and building a 3-bin system and having some trainings, people started showing up. They saw us out there in the yard. They were curious. And before we knew it, we had about 20 of the 30 units participating in the site, which was great. And Ron was really one of the major mover and shakers in this site. Unfortunately, over the winter, Ron and both of the other managers of the site had serious health issues, all very different, but all serious enough that they weren't sure that they could continue doing the physical work of keeping the site going. I also just want to back up while I'm describing this site to say that this is a senior housing site, and the composting system was set up it wasn't on an easy to walk a sidewalk. It was off behind one of the housing spots. So they made the decision to shut it down in the winter, and the Barrie Housing Authority, which runs the site, had a food scrap hauler haul their food scraps. So they kept diverting their food scraps, but they weren't operating the compost during the winter. And then we had to figure out what to do when April came along, and we had 3 people who weren't physically up to the task. And we had not set up a contingency plan for this. So that's partly why I brought this up, is if you are looking at a site, even if you have a whole team that's ready to go, you might want to consider a backup contingency plan. In this case, we were dealing with a housing authority that we had been working with closely all along. So they got involved and had their maintenance staff help out with assisting people with getting their food scraps to the totes for hauling. Thankfully, Ron was able to rally and get the system going this spring and summer on a less rigorous scale than it had been. But we really actually aren't able to recruit more team members. We had a lot of people who wanted to participate, but there weren't any other managers or team members at this site. So there is no resolution here other than we have a few options. One is to go to fully hauling food scraps, and the other is to work more closely with the housing authority to train their maintenance staff on some basic management so the users can continue to participate in the site. They've already used the compost on their gardens. They have about 8 garden beds. The very last case scenario would be that the site gets decommissioned. I don't think that's going to happen because some of the folks who had serious health problems are recovering. But I wanted to just let you all know about that situation and think about what happens a year or two down the road. What happens if everybody has a major life event on the team? Then what? And this was a great example of that. The other, almost the opposite situation is the gentleman on the left that is Sandy Parr. He is a master composter and master gardener in Vermont, and he manages our community composting site at the North Branch Nature Center in Montpelier. And that site got set up, unlike the Quarry Hill housing site, where they came to us really excited to get compost in their backyard. We actually went to North Branch because this is a 400-member nature center that provides education and programming for the community, and they have property where they have demonstration sites for a variety of, of nature programs. So we were excited about their education space and wanted to set up community composting site as a demonstration site for our trainings. And we worked with the executive director there, and he brought in Sandy. And between the executive director and Sandy and ourselves, we went ahead and set up the site. However, we did not have a compost team that came forward from the site. And we actually had, of the 400 members, only about a half a dozen that brought food scraps. So we didn't have that much feedstock in terms of nitrogen, and we only had ultimately one person managing it, and that's Sandy in the picture there. So this site is a little bit problematic because we don't have a backup person if Sandy wants to take a break or go on vacation. The thing that works is he already was an ongoing volunteer as a master gardener at the Nature Center. He has hours there. He shows up twice a week. He participates in building their gardens, and he does some demo pollinator gardens and other work like that. So he added in the compost as part of his volunteer work that he was already doing. And we have brought in other master composters to help him, but they come maybe seasonally or for a few weeks or months. And then typically they, after a little while, they've gone away so far. And so far, our only long-term person is this gentleman here. So right now, it's not problematic because we don't have a lot of food scraps coming in, and most of the compost is actually from their garden. And it can still be a demonstration site. But in retrospect, I think we should have rethought setting up a community compost site with only one person who was a committed manager and with no actual team on the site. So I just wanted to bring those two to your attention to sort of think about some real world examples of what could go wrong or how to deal with situations that arise that you can't necessarily predict. And again, this is compost. So the worst case scenario is that the sites shut down or get decommissioned. And Natasha will talk more about what happens in that case and how to make these sites sustainable.
Yeah, thanks so much, Cassandra. Those are great examples, and they really show sort of, you can try to think of everything and have redundancy and have something happen like all three champions getting sick at the same or having health concerns at the same time, or you can have maybe not the full network, but it seems like it makes sense and we just want it to happen and to work. And I think both are great, and it just goes back to to understanding the goals for the different sites, especially in the North Branch site, where it was sort of maybe pushed a little bit. And then as well, just thinking about like, what is it sort of more broadly, I want to talk about like, how do you create sustainable sites? What does that look like? And what are the different components that go into that? So some of you may be the compost champions or on a compost team and really like, we're going to make this happen and I'm in it forever. And others may work at organizations that promote and provide different kinds of assistance. And so a question that we get a lot from all these different people who are involved is like, is about follow-up support and how much follow-up support and what kind of follow-up support, and how do you know, especially as an organization or even a compost champion, like a sort of the starter of a site, how do you know that your job is done and you can step back? Or what if you feel like it'll never be done and you're on the hook forever? How do you navigate those things? And I think Cassandra showed really nicely and sort of emphasized, like, like, look, this is all, a lot of this is sort of trial and error and good intention. And if a site is really just not practical or feasible at some point, there are becoming more options for diverting organics from landfills, and we can, in that case, it's helpful to try to help the people who were diverting to a site figure out how else to do it, like Cassandra said, maybe through curbside pickup, which is available in their area. But to be really sustainable, like that, there has to be this sense of ownership among the people who are participating in it. It needs to be cultivated. And in my experience, working with a lot of different sites, either from the very, very beginning or sites that are just feeling really kind of stuck and burnt out, is that it comes back to the conversation we started at the beginning of this webinar in terms about identifying shared values and goals. Like, this needs to be the touchstone that the group can return to regularly. It's the why. Why are you doing it? What are you getting out of it? What is the personal connection or community connection to the site? And it's also come up for sites. There's some interesting sites out there that have been in operation for a long time, and it's almost, for those of you who work in the nonprofit world, might be familiar with it as founder syndrome, right? Like, there's people who the site is successful and it's great, and new people are coming in, and they may have slightly different ideas about what the site is and what the goals of the site, or how to interact with the site, and that can be uncomfortable. And how do you navigate all of that? Or if you have member turnover, and so there can definitely be some growing pains felt, especially if there is sort of a diversion of original intention for a site and what new people sort of want to remake the site and to fit their own goals. This is a really natural part of that happens with any community group, compost or otherwise. So it is not something that is unique or insurmountable. And it's important, I think, for sites to consciously create a space for the sites to evolve. Like, that's sort of the natural thing of the longer a site exists. There's going to be some tweaking of the site, there's going to be changeover and people engaged, and there needs to be space for it to evolve. Where it gets really tricky is if there's no guidelines for clear communication, or if you hadn't ever had the conversation about why the site exists or what the goals are, then assumptions start being made, there's miscommunication, feelings get hurt, and it's this sort of like soft skill that comes to community sites and that needs to be integrated in some way. So I just want to highlight that, and really just, like, even if you didn't start with these conversations, it's never too late to say, like, hey, this is why I think we're doing this, but we never really talked about it. What do you think? And then just to have some very purposeful space for not only the dialogue, but for that, there might be some compromises, especially in sites that have been going for a while and maybe have some new folks who are contributing. On the slide are 5 sort of general key ingredients for sustainable sites. So strong partnerships, not only among the community site contributors and stewards, but also within the wider community. And this can also really connect to, like, the sense of belonging and the stronger community resilience overall. Technical assistance, going back to that training, it's iterative, it needs to be diverse. This is really about the system and site management, but also about the community building that needs to be sort of continually nurtured from the inside out. And that could be, as Libby said, retraining folks if they come in and it's been a while, or new folks who are contributing, taking the time to walk them through the system. Creating system redundancy can help with that. So in ways that work for those involved. Shared leadership, more than one site manager, or rotating leadership, good record keeping that could be accessible to folks if all the site managers go down for one reason or another or are taken away. Is there a log that someone sort of the team can pick up and understand where the system was left off and keep it managed well. Or contacts for like, where did we, oh, this person's gone, but where they were the ones getting the wood chips, where is that? So having all of those things written out and sort of a logbook of how the sites are run. And then a buddy system is a great way as well to bring new people on board. So scheduling volunteers in pairs, and ideally pairing it maybe at some point, especially for sites as they start to mature and bring new people on. Like pairing someone with experience with someone new, so there can be sort of like on the go, on the fly training, sort of going as part of their volunteer commitment. So succession plans. This can be a funny one to talk about for some people, and sometimes there's really resistance. But as Cassandra pointed out, sometimes life just gets in the way of best intentions, and it can be really helpful and important for the sustainability of a site to not be overly reliant on a single person. And it's also unrealistic to think that a compost site leader or key team member will just be there forever, because that's often just not how lives go. So this is something that if you're involved in a site and you haven't thought about, never too late to start the conversation. If you're starting a site, it's great to be thinking about it up front as well. And there are mechanisms that just can be set up that can help with the succession and bringing new people in and giving them a little bit more responsibility as we go. Some sites have set up a dues, like a membership dues that is small and still affordable, but people who are actually diverting their food scraps there and managing them in the compost system pay, a small amount, but that can come together to be a stipend for a compost leader, which is another way of recognizing a level of commitment and all the work that goes into it. It can also make it a little bit more attractive, not that it's, a huge hourly wage, but it is some recognition within the community of a leadership position, and that can make it more of a draw for some people to get involved and to actually take on those different levels of responsibility. So these are just different ideas of how to think about how do you keep more people engaged, and how do you really plan to sort of bring people on and pass off responsibilities from one to another. We do also work with groups to think about decommission or contingency plans. At any site that there's a combination of material goods in terms of tumblers and bins or tools, and very likely a variety of organics at varying stages of decomposition. So having a plan in place for what needs to happen, that someone, who may just be a volunteer and not even necessarily be that involved, would be like having the whole community know what's going to happen. What is the contingency plan? What does a closure plan look like in case it needs to either temporarily or potentially permanently get closed? And people really don't like to think about that, especially at the beginning if they're setting it up. But it's just good. It's good project practice to just think these things all the way through if possible. And it makes dealing with it in the moment, when often it's an unplanned, maybe an unplanned thing has happened, it's a little bit less of a hardship. So Libby, if you can go to the next slide on resources. I know there's only so much we can do in an hour, and we're right at the hour line here. I just want to highlight, and you will have, I've seen some questions about whether these slides will be made available. So we actually wrote out the URLs. There's a lot of different resources available that support all of this on the Northeast Recycling Council website, on our website, the Composting Association of Vermont. There's a link there, has everything from different manuals and trainings to templates for signage and examples of signage. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance has a relatively recent great best management practices for community composting manual that is a good resource. Central Vermont Solid Waste Management District has a really nice compost booklet on backyard composting. And then as well, many states have master composter programs. For states, if you're in a state that does not, I think all of them are online. I know at least for Vermont, our Master Composter program, a number of folks are from out of state. So if you're in a state where you can't get that level of training in state, do some searching and find a program that you can go through online, and as well as if there are Master Composter programs in your state, the Master Composters themselves who have been through the program are wonderful resources. And great people to bring in. So with that, I think we're just going to give a special thanks to our project partners and to Libby and Cassandra for being on this and NERC for hosting, as well as to the USDA Rural Utilities Program, who is funding this larger project that this webinar is part of. And now I think we can, we have about 10 minutes left for questions, which I think should be a good amount of time. Just off the bat, I've seen a number of questions from people saying, asking if there's going to be a recording made available. Yes, it is, if you missed that in the beginning. And you're welcome to download the handouts from this webinar in the handouts section on the control panel, but links to those same resources will also be made available when you get the email about the recording. So if you don't have time or you can't find the handout section and go to webinar, you will get follow-up links to that. I also just quickly want to give a plug for this larger project. We're developing a whole set of resources and tip sheets that will be made freely available on all of our websites. And so they'll become available in the coming months. So you'll be able to access those as well, likely from the same links for at least for NERC and for CAV that I gave you that you have on that resource slide. So I see one question, one of the early questions was differentiating between materials and feedstocks. And we'll get into that a little bit more in part two, but generally speaking, I just wanted to, they're basically the same. So often when I talk just about feedstocks, people who may not be as integrated into composting don't know what that is. And so I guess at this level of overview webinar, I bounce back and forth in the language I use. So when I say the materials being added into a system, or the greens and the browns, or ingredients for the compost recipe, those are all essentially the same as feedstocks. Feedstocks are just all the different parts that go into making compost. We had a question about whether there are documents or images to provide an idea of size and scale for what 1 cubic yard of food waste looks like. I do have a slide for that from a different one I'm happy to post or share. And you can also, I'm sure, find, I mean, I'm guessing if you just did a Google search, image search, you'd probably come up with some, but I'm happy to post a link to a slide that I have that sort of shows that. And then anything that compares the volume reduction from fresh inputs versus finished inputs. The visuals may help people see the benefit of diverting food waste. So a lot of those types of visuals are actually integrated in what will be part 2 of this webinar series. So when we get into actually more, excuse me, what are the ingredients, what do the feedstocks look like going into a system and coming out of the system, and we'll get into, in that section, we'll get into a little bit of soil health and compost use as well, sort of finished compost. That's not going to be the main focus of that webinar, but we will touch on those. And so you can look for some of those resources coming in the next section. And then someone says, consider possibly using visuals for limited English, and they actually give a link. And I will check with Lynn. I'm not sure if she's on still, but I'm not sure if there's a way to share some of these resources. Or if you guys can see that in the question. There's a URL that looks like it likely has some examples of visuals for limited English speakers. So that's a great thing to have.
Yeah. So I am still here, and Natasha, let's touch base. In addition to, in the next couple of days, all the resources being posted on the homepage of the NERC website, we will have an article in the February email bulletin about this webinar. And Natasha, if you feel that we should include this link in it, I'll certainly do that.
Great, I'll check it out. And so stay tuned for that. And then we have a lot of thank yous. Someone says, I may have missed this, or maybe it's in part 2. Can any of you speak to how to go about actual candidate development for sites? Maine is very rural, but identifying and designating sites can still be a struggle. So, and I think that's actually the last, oh no, there's a few other questions. Well, let's just tackle that. And if we don't get through all of the questions, I'll go ahead and look through them and work with Lynn to answer some of the more common questions, maybe as part of or linked to in the newsletter. So that might be a way to just deal with some of that. So in terms of identifying and designating sites, that really gets to what Libby, Cassandra, and I were all talking about in terms of the role that you may be playing and the reasons for a site. Is it being driven because you're committed to and engaged in helping communities figure out just food scrap diversion? How do you create that sense of ownership? How do you find and cultivate those compost champions? In some sites, in some regions or places that I've worked, this also gets back to a little bit of bringing in and really engaging backyard composters. If you have some links in your community to who may be active and avid backyard composters, they're often can provide a spark for community scale composting as well. And then if they have been active backyard composters, they likely have at least some basic know-how of the science to get them going or to work with you. That might be actually a nice topic for a blog post, so I'll consider that. Someone says, can you go through the pros and cons of siting a community compost on private land versus town land? We didn't really touch on that, and we'll get into that some in the compost siting and the site selection in part 2. Just briefly, it depends on it also depends on whose land, right? So there was a neighborhood community site. It was just 4 houses, and it was really just on a street. And so a backyard composter really wanted to scale up because she wanted more volume, so she could have more heat through the winter, and hopefully have more success with winter composting. And so she invited some neighbors, and they started contributing to that. But then they ended up moving, and so she dismantled it, and then the people were sort of left like, wait, hang on a second. So even sometimes when it's on private land, depending on whose land it is and what their position is, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like a forever site. And Libby and Cassandra, feel free to chime in on this as well if you have anything to own. If you're leasing land or if it's town land, you need to make sure in all cases to understand what your local ordinances are. We'll get into more of that in part 2 in terms of sort of rules and regs around it to be thinking about. But there's a really nice little community food scrap place being started at a food shelf, and that's likely, it's going to integrate into the people who run the food shelf and training volunteers at the food shelf as well to manage it. And so that has some, I think, sustainability, and that is on town land, but it has some options for sustainability. And so I think that there can be pros and cons for both, and it just really depends on the setting and who owns the land and who's then going to be engaged on it. Is it town land, but people are just sort of using it, but not necessarily fully integrated into, it's not like at my food shelf example, or is it really, more integrated as a town activity? That may also get to scale and some other regulation issues. Cassandra, do you have any thoughts or want to chime in on that particular question?
It's a great question. I was actually thinking about our sites. I have 5 sites set up in central Vermont in our district, and I think only one of them is on public land. That's the North Branch Nature Center. And I'm not even entirely sure if that's public. So I think it's really, our focus was more about making sure that the site made sense in terms of the neighbors and proximity to waters. There's a couple of sites that have streams nearby, and we paid less attention to whether it was public or private land. So I'm not sure if that's helpful.
Yeah, great. So there are a number of other questions, and I will still take time to go through them and share them with my co-presenters, Libby and Cassandra, and figure out some way of communicating back. We'll coordinate with Lynn. But just quickly, there were a couple just specifically around like the facilities, like what community composting sites should accept. Like, should they accept compostable forks or packaging or meat or different things like that, and that is really geared towards towards what the community can handle and what the system they choose can handle. And so we often recommend that new groups start more conservative and get there to know their system and really get through and know that they can. Especially a lot of the compostable packaging, some breaks down in cold composting, but much of it breaks down only in hot composting. So until you have your system really running and you're consistently getting hot temperatures and you understand your recipe, we're going to get into a lot more of this in part 2. We recommend that you start with what you're pretty confident of. And so at that point, I would not necessarily recommend starting with the compostable products, not starting with meat and bones or oil, those kinds of things. And some of it, some of those things are fine in hot composting, but if you're not sure you're getting those temperatures that reduce pathogens, I'd just caution a little bit against that until you have your system running. And then it's also really a comfort level of your team, of your site. And from my experience, that varies widely. So that's a conversation to have up front. What are you going to accept? What do you feel okay about accepting? Once you get your system running and your confidence up, revisit it. That's totally fine. You can change your rules anytime as long as there's a process for that and it's well communicated and the training goes along with it. And so with that, I'm afraid we are out of time, but we will certainly be, there are some Vermont specific questions. And so as well, we'll try to get to all of these questions in some way and communicate back out to you, the ones that we weren't able to cover today. And with that, I'm just going to say a big thank you for everybody who stayed on for the duration, and feel free to reach out to us directly as well if you have follow-up conversations or questions. Thanks. Bye-bye.